And also welcome to everybody who's joined us online, because this meeting will be live webcast today as well. So for the people who are here, just a tiny bit of housekeeping. So just to tell you where the fire exits are. So we've got a fire exit to my right here, and one here, and one out towards the back of the room as well. And my understanding is that there are no plans for a fire drill today. So if you hear it, please do leave, and leave fast. The toilets, for anybody who needs them, are just straight through that door there. So I am so excited to be chairing this panel today, but it is sad because Amanda, our CEO, sadly is trapped somewhere on a train between Edinburgh and Glasgow. So believe me, I'm a very, very bad imitation, but hopefully she will be able to get here for the closing remarks, and you'll be able to hear her insights at that point. So this event is really about the launch of our report, Women on the Frontline, Healing the Earth and Seeking Justice. This report is really about the fact that we all know, and it's becoming more known, that women are disproportionately affected by climate change, and more importantly, that prioritising women's strengths, their knowledge and capabilities in constructing climate change responses is a condition for seeking justice for climate adaptation and for loss and damage. The report advocates support for women's initiatives and addresses what lies at the heart of climate justice, namely that political power, or lack thereof, is one of the things which is a barrier to people being able to achieve dignity and to becoming empowered. The meeting today is also framed as the latest in a series of events that we've been hosting since International Women's Day last year, which explores what a new feminist social contract for people and planet could look like. One that delivers on the Paris Agreement, on human rights, and on the Sustainable Development Goals. We think that in order to build this social contract and to really understand what it is that we owe each other and our responsibilities to each other and to the common good, but also to our planet and to those on the front line who are defending our planet and trying to build a safe ecosystem, that we really need to transform our relationships. And we really need to recognise that as we come out of the pandemic, which has hit some people really hard. Yes, it's been experienced by everybody all over the world, but it's been disproportionately experienced by those living in the global south, where in some countries, less than 1% of people have still got vaccines. My understanding is across the continent of Africa, only 4% of people have had access to vaccines. So that's really a stark indication of the unequal world that we live in. And that's the context against which we launch this report today. We recognise that in order for us to deliver this feminist social contract, we need to adopt a decolonial approach to climate change, and we need to shift power and resources to the women and the global south to deliver co-benefits for gender, climate, and environmental justice. This panel is invited to consider what action is needed to support this, and the panel should keep their interventions to around 5 minutes. I'll now introduce you to our panel. So, to my left, we have Kavita Naidu, and Kavita is a climate expert, who has done fantastic writing on climate change and feminism. I'm very honoured to have His Excellency Dr. Wilbur Otichilo, Governor of Viha County and Chair of the Environment and Climate Change Council at the Council of Governors. And it's very pertinent that we have invited His Excellency today, because one of the case studies in the report actually looks at local level climate change adaptation, and it is based in Kenya. On Zoom, we have, we're going to be, technology being what it is, we've got Ikal online, and I would very much like to to welcome Ikal. And Ikal is a climate activist from Kenya who's been doing fantastic work on really exploring what a just transition looks like and really understanding those links between climate change and poverty. And we also have our esteemed colleague, Rudelmar Bueno de Faria, the CEO, Executive Director of the ACT Alliance, which is a really close ally to Christian Aid and an ally that we really enjoy working with. They've done amazing work over the past week at COP. Lots of the stunts that they've been doing have got fantastic media attention. And I think that we can all say that the faith component at this COP has been really visible and really, really good. So congratulations and thank you. So we've also got a short film, and we're going to go straight to the short film now. This film is from one of the case studies that we gathered for the report. And I'm a real believer in let's not speak for people, let them speak for themselves. So we felt that by actually capturing their voice, we'd be able to bring the voices of some of the most marginalised communities that we work with. But marginalised communities where incredible women are showing leadership every day. So if I can just hand over, and we'll see how the technology works, and hopefully we'll be able to get the film for us right now.
Saizi nimejitolea kuwasaidia wamama na kusimama nao waelekeza kwa ile mahali yenye watapata usaidizi. Nimeona kuna mabadiliko kwa sababu kila mara nikitoa sauti ya kupeleka malalamishi, kuna wale wanasikiza na wananyamaza na kuna wale wanafuatilia.
Daga moye gana denam tufirshida qabdini ababu warbadi qurani biisi warbadi bisanisi warbadi sagale si nami boru atwalin dem telen ojagal sagale sigafata atille yo khana aluma dufte kana deni fashida mingi iralir
Mimi kwa majina naitwa Sadia Isako. Mimi ni mama, nimeolewa. Mimi ni mama mwenye ninakuanga kwa kikundi ya wamama. Mimi kuwa kwenye hii forum ya wamama na kuwasaidia na kuwahamasisha, nimeona tangu nianze hii kazi. Saizi kuna wamama wenye sauti yao imesikika mpaka wamepata ile mahitaji yenye walikuwa wanatafuta. Kwa mfano, kuna wamama wamepata nafasi ya kuingia kwa public participation. Walikuwa wafugaji na saizi hawana. Wamefunzwa hali ya kujisaidia kwa njia nyingine ya kupanda mboga karibu na nyumba. Nikienda kwa hii forum na nikipeleka malalamishi, nimeona sauti ya wanaume ndio inasikika sana, ya wamama haisikilizwi. Lakini niliona nikifuatilia na nikirudia kuna vile wananisikiza na wanachukua hatua. Lakini nikiwacha tu na siku ya kwanza inawaachiliwa hapo tu, hakuna kushughulikiwa.
Can we have some light? Thank you. So that was a short film, and that was featuring a community in Marsabit County, northern Kenya, where people are practicing traditional pastoralism and have found their lives and livelihoods under threat from the pressure which is being caused by climate change. So I loved that film. I just thought it was just so uplifting. So I hope you enjoyed it as well as me. I'm afraid you're going to hear a lot from me today. I'm sorry about that, because I'm now going to take you through the report. But we've already sort of given a short introduction So if you can just bear with me for a second. So, next slide, please. So when we decided to embark on this project, to write this report, what we aimed to do was, as we said about the film, really sort of bring those voices and bring those experiences to this COP so that those voices which, because of the lack of access this year, have been very, very difficult to get here, would be heard. But for Christian Aid, when we talk about climate action, what we envisage is an action which addresses power inequalities at all levels. And this is in line with Christian Aid's approach to climate resilience, because we see it as a political challenge, not just as a technical challenge. And we sought to make the connection between patriarchy and the extractive practices of colonial and neo-colonial injustices, which drives vulnerability, both for the climate vulnerable countries and the small island states, but also for marginalised individuals. And as all feminists know, the personal is political. Slide, please. So how did we go about it? So the first step was we consulted with our country teams, and we've got a really big global partner network as well, so we consulted with them. And we identified what we thought would be really good case studies and really good examples that would tell the sort of variety of experiences about adaptation and about the experiences of loss and damage. And then in step 2, given that one of our main arguments in the report is about valuing women's knowledge and listening to women's experiences, we wanted to adopt a sort of feminist approach to research. So we used a qualitative approach which undertook in-depth interviews in Kenya, Brazil, Honduras, Bangladesh, and the Philippines. And this is in 2021. And then our third step was we triangulated against the literature survey, including from the feminist climate justice movement, because we recognise that if we're really going to make a difference, we all have to be aligned and we all have to be speaking from the same hymn sheet. What we identified that there's many common themes across different country contexts which are pointing to intersecting and intersectional discriminations and co-benefits for gender, climate and environmental justice. And they pointed to a need for further research to deepen our analysis. And this report just scratches the surface. It really is just a snapshot. And I think one of the outcomes was we need more research, which is a classic, I think, as well. So it's sort of one of those received truths that people most vulnerable to climate change know best what's needed in their contexts. And therefore, more locally led adaptation initiatives should be supported, especially those run by women's organisations. So this report's trying to land that by showing that the experiences of the women in the communities that we looked at are so rich that they are the experts. We need international climate finance that should be directed to support the resilience and adaptive capacities of the people disproportionately affected, and those are the women, the youth, and the marginalised communities. We need decentralised and flexible mechanisms that should provide adequate and long-term financing for locally led adaptation and ensure that representative decision-making happens with women at all levels. And having worked in many countries, in Lebanon, in Kenya, and in the Democratic Republic of Congo, I can tell you that at the very, very micro local level, there are people making decisions, life and death decisions, every day that we can really learn from and that we can really take that on board and to share to inform our practice. And in Kenya, from the film that we've just been watching, we learned that decentralised climate finance is enabling women in pastoralist communities to advance their priorities and to challenge gender norms. Slide, please. So we know that we need to transition to renewable energy. There's no doubt about that, and it shouldn't have to be an either-or. But a just transition means avoiding approaches which have a detrimental impact on people and the environment. And our report tells us of examples which are both good in Honduras and really not so good in the community in the Amazon, which we cover there as well. We find that energy poverty, which is one of the things really trapping people in poverty, really stopping kids from going to school, really stopping people from breaking out and being able to actually build dignified lives for themselves. We find that we can address that, but we do it by good adaptation and resilience, and we make sure that it is transformative. So we can also make sure that we're really shifting those gender norms as well as delivering on those renewable energy. We also find that centralised approaches fail to reach everyone or meet everybody's needs, and often involve environmental and social impacts which affect women and marginalised communities most. And I do encourage you to look at the example that we put in the report from our rivering communities, the Quilombola, because it's so sad that it actually, whenever I was working on it, it sort of brought me to tears, actually. And decentralised renewable energy technologies are often the cheapest and the quickest solution, and enhance local agency for defining and delivering energy priorities. Slide, please. We know that to reduce climate risk demands that ecosystems are protected and nature-based solutions, gender-responsive nature-based solutions, that recognise women's collective action is supported. Women are at the forefront as environmental defenders. In the Philippines, women on small islands at risks of typhoons are coming together to restore protective mangroves and protect fisheries from destructive practices. Women are also key to informal social protection in Bangladesh, and women-led organisations are overcoming patriarchal norms to build their capacities to engage in disaster risk reduction and response, and ensure that the most vulnerable in their communities are protected and can access entitlements. Slide, please. So what are we going to do about this? It's all very well pointing out what all the problems are. So we do have some recommendations at the end. We think all governments should ensure that climate change is coherent with gender justice. There are ways of ensuring that you can do gender-responsive budgeting, for example, to make sure that when your funding is channeled, it gets to those who need it most. We need to ensure that we're shoring up human rights and the leave no one behind principle. And I love the leave no one behind principle because a rising tide carries all boats. So whenever you do targeted interventions at the most marginalised, everybody benefits from that. So it's a win-win. We need to make sure that the major economies, and especially the historic emitters, should ensure that climate-vulnerable countries have sufficient climate finance that is targeted through gender transformative funding streams. And I've been here just for one day, but honestly, listening to the wrangling over loss and damage and the fact that we haven't even been able to deliver the 100 billion, there's like, oh, we've got 80, and maybe we can put it over a longer timeline, just makes me feel that people are not really taking this seriously. So our job is to make them take it seriously. We need international solidarity. We need enhanced international climate finance split evenly between mitigation and adaptation, and a mechanism to ensure that it can get to the most local level. We need debt cancellation, because the difficult choices that countries have to make between paying so much of their GDP on debt, or are they going to invest in a just transition, or are they going to be able to make good on the loss and damage which has happened from the latest hurricane or the floods? And I lived in Kenya, and I was in Nakuru whenever it flooded last year, and it was absolutely just heartbreaking to see people just being completely displaced. We need loss and damage, and we need to provide new, additional and needs-based loss and damage finance. And we need a mechanism. We need an above-country mechanism which decides where it's going to go to and how it's going to be distributed. But on top of all of this, really big picture, what we need is system change. Our system is not working for the poorest. And we need a transformation in the systems and structures that perpetuate power inequalities and a transformation in economies and societies towards valuing and recognising women's work and initiatives and prioritising resources for investing in care and progressing rights. Because not only were women doing amazing things in Honduras, putting in solar panels, building renewable energy technologies, but they were having to go home and care for their family as well. And that is part of the economy and should be recognised as part of the economy. It's called the care economy. So thank you so much for your patience. And now we're going to hand over to the genuinely exciting people in this panel. We're going to go through it. We're going to hear, first of all, from Kavita. Then we're going to hear from His Excellency, Dr. Wilbur Otichilo. Then from Ikal, who's being very patient online. And then we'll hear from Rudelmar. So thank you. So if I can just hand over to Kavita now.
Thank you. Fiona, that was so good. I'm not sure what else I can add. Today's Gender Day at COP. And so, you know, this morning, it's very important to those of us who are working on feminist climate justice, what this actually means. And so I'll begin by paying my deepest respect and gratitude to the feminist activists, particularly those who are Black, coloured, queer, living with disability, and working class, who have forged the path that many of us walk today. We all stand on the proud shoulders of those brave women who had the courage and audacity to stand up to patriarchy at a time when patriarchy wasn't a thing, much less climate change. But it was for those leaders past that we have the wisdom to build intersectional feminist movements now and lay a path for leaders emerging to continue fighting injustices driven by colonialism, neoliberalism, and capitalist systems. The climate crisis has really pulled together diverse feminist and social movements, including trade unions, youths, Indigenous peoples, faith-based organizations, and more recently, the health sector, to recognize the compounding crises we face affects us all, but it is not gender neutral. Climate justice is a feminist issue because women at the front lines are defending their land, their water, their resources, and their very livelihoods, despite facing the worst brunt of its impacts. And this is most recognized in the Global South, as Fiona has shared. The greatest leaders in the fight against climate injustices are the women who are mobilizing at the grassroots level. Yesterday, we celebrated the Gender Just Climate Solution Awards, where 150 different feminists have led locally led projects from across the world showcasing the innovation, talent, and solutions that women in all their diversity are creating to address climate impacts. These include locally led and community-owned energy systems, cooperatives, microcredit systems, agroecology, and it's a long list. But the problem is that these solutions are actually not being discussed at COP. What's being discussed at COP, especially those who are following the negotiations, is carbon offsets, market mechanisms, everything that is going to replicate the capitalist system and still make profit for the elite. So, you know, whether these women are starting on their own or building communities or setting up national networks, they are building power. And by supporting each other, improving women's rights and gender equality while mitigating and adapting to climate change. From Vanessa Nakate to Greta Thunberg to Zie Bastida and hundreds of young girls and women from around the world who are able to amass thousands on the streets and speak truth to power, that's when we know we are creating waves that will build into an ocean against climate injustices. We saw the power on the streets right here in Glasgow this Saturday. Frontline defenders are Indigenous women who are putting their lives at risks to challenge extractive and polluting industries in the land. Many have mobilized and brought cases to their courts, seeking injunctions and redress. Feminist awareness and education is increasingly opening STEM opportunities for women and young girls. So even in the field of science, engineering, and technology, women are leading solutions to address climate change. In every sector, every village, every city, women are connecting with each other, and whether they identify as a feminist or not, their actions are paving the way for collective feminist climate justice. Global solidarity has never been stronger than right now, when the pandemic has thrown many marginalized women into deeper poverty, inequality, discrimination, and violence. COVID-19 has also exposed the magnitude of the care crisis in our societies. Globally, women work longer days, and they earn 24% less than men. And at the current rate of progress, it will take 170 years to close that gap. 700 million fewer women are in paid work than men. 75% of women in developing regions are in the informal economy, where they're less likely to have legal rights and are often not paid enough to escape poverty. 600 million are in the most insecure and precarious forms of work. Women do at least twice as much unpaid care work, such as childcare and housework, often on top of their paid work. This has been valued at nearly $11 trillion, and yet, out of the world's 1 billion poorest people, 70% are women and girls. Feminist climate finance is critical to challenge patriarchal systems of wealth distribution. Gender inequality in the economy costs women in developing countries $9 trillion a year. And this is worsening during disasters, humanitarian crisis, and loss and damage. Strong public health care systems, which include social protections and safety nets, is critical in protecting marginalized communities, including women and children, and those who are indigenous, migrant, and refugees. The availability and access to quality public services is necessary to protect the human rights to shelter, food, health, education, security, and work. It would provide the financial means and resources to restore, repair, and rebuild the livelihoods impacted by climate change. States must generate and sustain public spending and investment in public services that assess gendered risks, delivers universal social income, ensures payments go directly to women who have care responsibility through unconditional cash transfers, and promote women's vocational training. Scaled up, long-term, and consistent public investments in the care economy, divesting from fossil fuels and military and prison infrastructure, and investing in care is absolutely critical to the work that we do. Therefore, expanding and strengthening employment in care work is equivalent in investing in a just and equitable transition that creates green and low-carbon employment for women. And this is why a decolonial, feminist, global Green New Deal upholds the long-standing call for climate reparations from developed countries to compensate for emitting the vast majority of historical carbon emissions, as well as for loss and damage. And Fiona's explained this really well. A decolonial feminist global Green New Deal will regulate the financial sector. It will ensure that developed countries honor reparations through aid and pay their fair shares for the historical role in fueling the climate crisis. And it's up to us women to let those elite white men in positions of power and privilege know that we are here and we are demanding gender and climate justice for everyone. If women stop, the world stops. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Kavita. Can I hand over to His Excellency?
It's okay. First, I want to take this opportunity on my own behalf and on the behalf of the Council of Governors to thank you most sincerely for inviting me to participate in this very important meeting where we are discussing the role of women in climate change. It's a privilege for us to participate because women play a very crucial role in our society, particularly in developing countries. And actually, they are the champions in those societies. And therefore, my being here is a testimony that as county governments, we recognize the role women play in our society. Despite of the challenges they face, they are the pillars of our society. And therefore, this meeting is very timely, and listening for the few minutes I've been here, I can see that the agenda is very valid and very consistent with what we as Council of Governors in Kenya believe. I wish to thank Christian Aid for the role it is playing in this area of climate change and the general role it's playing in our society to ensure that there is equity and there is fairness in what goes on in our society. As a governor of Vihiga County, I want to put on record that we have continued to work very closely with Christian Aid. And for the last 2 years, we have been collaborating in a number of activities, and particularly in the area of climate change. Christian Aid has helped us mobilize our local communities and create awareness on the importance of climate change and what we need to do. Further, Christian Aid has helped us even when we were preparing our policy and legal frameworks on climate change. So I would like to say that we are partners with Christian Aid, and we need to encourage you to continue working with us. I've just seen this film on Marsabit, and I happen to have worked in Marsabit many years, so I know Marsabit very well. And it's a testimony that you are going into communities that are more vulnerable and disadvantaged, which is a nice thing. I have spent a week in the COP26. I have been attending various sessions, and my impression is that, yes, there is a realization that climate change is real, is causing a lot of problems to the communities worldwide, is going to remain with us for a long time to come, and we need to find solutions, and we need to stop too much talking, too many meetings, and too many resolutions. So for me, as I go back to Kenya, I'm convinced that we must take action at our own level. We may not need to wait for this financing that has been promised. From 2009, I was in Copenhagen when the $100 billion was pledged, and now we are 2021. That money has not been availed, and where it has been availed in whatever proportion, to access to it is not easy because there are no instruments or structures on how to access. So as countries, particularly those coming from developed countries who are mostly affected by climate change, we will need to move forward and take the action in whatever capacity we can, so that we don't wait. Because the more we wait, the more things are getting worse. So we need to take action. As I go back, I've decided the destiny of climate change is in our hands, in my county, and I will do everything possible to ensure that we do what we can to deal with it. Because as many of the leaders have made passionate appeals and commitments that we need to take action now. But when you sit down and look at what the technical committees are doing, they are not implementing what the leaders have said. The technical committees are still there arguing on the obvious things that we have argued for all these years, have been in all these COPs. So I feel very frustrated that I do not need probably to continue attending these COPs, because it's like where you just go to talk, but you are talking the obvious, what you know, and you do nothing. However, I must say that one of the important issues that has given me hope in this COP26 is, at least yesterday, when we are discussing about adaptation and damage and loss. I think for the first time I heard all those who are speaking saying that we need to focus on adaptation. That adaptation is where we need to focus. Any funding that is available should be channeled to adaptation, because we have agreed that climate change is here with us. Even if we do all the things we have said we will do, we are not going to change it for the next probably 100 or so years. So the best is to learn how to live with a changing climate. So I think the realization and acknowledgement that we need to focus on adaptation, to me, is something that is refreshing and encouraging in this COP26. Because for all the other COPs that we have had, focus has been on mitigation. And mitigation has only been focusing on big companies, big entities, not the communities. But with adaptation, I was also very happy yesterday. I attended a meeting where they were looking at principles that have generally been agreed on how to have community-led climate change actions. I think that's where we are, because that's where the problem is. The problem may not be in Glasgow here. The problem is in the villages, in the real most, interior villages, probably, in Scotland. I don't know where there are villages there, but in Africa, right in the community, that's where the problem is. That's where the impacts of climate change are being felt. So by focusing on adaptation, I think there is hope that now probably funds can be channeled, but be channeled to the right areas, the right communities. And one thing that also struck me or made me happy is that quite a number of countries, the developed countries, were pledging certain amounts of money to support climate change and particularly adaptation. But of course, they were not saying how it will be done. So again, that leaves us as counties or countries to be able to engage in a bilateral discussions on how we can be able to access that money. Finally, for us in Kenya and for us as Council of Governors, for us, we are ahead. In fact, when I listened to everything, I said, we are ahead of everybody here. Because for us, we already organized a funding which is financing of locally led climate change action. We already yesterday, we launched a funding that will fund our 47 counties to the tune of $150 million. And we launched the program yesterday. And we are ready, and this money will be channeled direct to the communities, not at the headquarters, but to the communities. So I would say, for me, I'm going back happy knowing that we are going to the village, to the community, where the action should happen. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Your Excellency, and thank you for your leadership as well. That is great, great to hear. We're actually going to go on to Zoom now, and we're going to hear from Ikal Angelei, who is an incredible climate activist who works at the most local level. So a very different perspective that we're going to hear now.
Can you hear me?
Because we can't hear you speaking at the minute.
Can you hear me? So I'm on.
She has to speak louder.
Oh, goodness. I think it's this end.
I can hear you.
Sorry, Ikal, we're just sorting it out this end, so thank you so much for your patience. Oh, really?
Can you hear me?
Christian had about 2 weeks ago. Wow. Actually, I know I don't want to speak over her, but it was really making the point about we don't want the new transition to be the new oil, you know? Yeah. The old, the new curse.
Okay, try again.
1, 2, 3, 4. Can you hear me?
Yay! Ikal,
Okay.
we hear you. Thank you.
Great. Thanks to the technical team. Thanks, Fiona, for this. Thanks for my fellow panelists. It is good to see an old ally and friend, Dr. Otichilo. I first met him when he was a member of parliament and the chair of the environmental committee, and he helped us raise the issue on the Gibetri Dam in parliament. So it's good to see that he keeps the spirit. Maybe after this COP, he will join the rest of us, because I have never been to the COP. It's a whole different conversation around that. So listening to the report and the panelists speak, I just have a few points to bring in. So I come from a pastoralist community in northern Kenya, similar to the one in Marsabit. I think that was the Rendila that you were capturing in that story. And our struggle is a struggle for water and pasture, but it is also linked to land use changes that are affecting how we access that water and pasture. I got into this work as an accident, and I guess for many indigenous communities, local groups, we do not plan to get into activism. The situation where we are situated is what leads us into activism, and that's what happened to me. This is 10 years later, but I guess it's not 10 years, it's all my life. I've been an activist. It's just different situations and different geographies.
So when we speak about the impact of one as highly as well put out, is that women are affected disproportionately. Women with disabilities are affected further disproportionately. The LGBTQI plus women, community are affected even more disproportionately. So you see this continuous marginalization of women, not only in terms of how they're impacted, but also the ability, the platforms to voice their concerns, their aspirations, but really just to amplify their voices. This continues to be seen. Marginalized women, indigenous women, again, fall within that category. And as the conversations in the COP continue to focus on whether it's finance, whether it's the transition, I sit in a place where I constantly worry about this rush, even within the energy transition, but also even the climate conversation. I think one thing that has been mentioned by fellow panelists is that the climate change discourse, the climate crisis, is a systemic crisis. We've got to look at it from a water issue, a poverty issue, an economic issue, various angles. And I might disagree with Dr. Otichilo that yes, we're just adapting to it and is the only solution, but it is it's a man-made crisis. The decisions we make in my country, for example, the increased interest in extraction of resources, the conversations around tree planting, but at the same time a government that is making decisions to cut trees for infrastructure. And yes, we need the infrastructure, but we've also got to think about what is the climate-based infrastructure, climate sensitive infrastructure that is being built. There is an appetite within the African continent to build new infrastructure related to the extractive resources. And this is worrying. As Fiona mentioned, small projects, but we're so big on big projects, large infrastructure, large dams. Sorry, my internet's a bit flaky. I'm going to go off video just for a bit. Yeah, so large dams, large infrastructure. We're constantly looking at the big projects, but that does not mean that it actually impacts or the related impact in terms of benefits is to the local community. So you see this big interest on huge infrastructure and that sort of financing, and that is scary. So when you really if we really are going to achieve a gender just transition, really linking climate justice to gender justice, we've got to think around, one, who's controlling the finance? It doesn't matter how many women get this financing, but whoever decides, the control, the governance, the real control, the real power around what is financed, who is financed. If it is not by the women, then we are just basically tokenizing climate finance. That is one thing we have to look at. When you talk about energy poverty and this narrative of energy poverty, we cannot talk about energy poverty in itself, because as much as many countries, including my own country, will say we have this many, and because when you're measuring access to energy, how it's based on households that have been linked to the grid. But then when you really look at it, by the time you give me energy, I'm connected to the grid, am I able to afford that consistent payment? And I think the SDGs has got to move from countries saying how many households, but to really say, when they're given this, who's paying for it? What are the costs of paying? How do they access it? Because between putting food on the table, and as much as Fiona said, that's what determines when people go to school, but I am telling you for free that it is highly likely that a child will not go to school because of hunger, but will be able to go to school because of electricity. And so we've got to be able to, as much as possible, stop siloing the discourse, because as you said, personal is political. Everything is interlinked. And that's why I believe that the gender justice conversation, the climate justice conversation is a systemic conversation we've got to have. And so unless we start to talk about the systemic issues, then we are stuck in one, we end up just sort of in many ways fragmentizing the struggle. And the fragmentation of the struggle is where the problem sits. I've been looking at the energy transition. I got into this work because of fighting a hydroelectric dam. And right now, the discussion, which sometimes makes me go different ways with a lot of my comrades, is that we are so quick to say, let the oil stay in the soil only. But then, and we're saying, let's go into renewable energies. But if you look at the current conversation of renewable energies, it means a bigger footprint in mining, in the mining sector. That means we're going to open up more minerals, mining pits. Yesterday, I read an energy piece, and they said the increase in copper production, the rise in mining companies running to countries where copper, bauxite, lithium, aluminium is happening, is worrying. And we all know the relationship between mining, land, water, health, and more so labor on children and women. So we've really got to ask ourselves, in this rush to address the climate crisis, are we going to create a worse crisis that we'll find ourselves afraid to speak out just because we were the ones who were pushing that agenda? And so we really have to ask ourselves, how do we do it? And I love the examples given by Fiona around small projects. But even in the small projects, again, it goes back to the ownership control of this. And looking at our own policies, work around, again, policy advocacy that looks at the feed-in tariffs within the energy laws, that because many countries, because of the political economy, because of the dance between politics and the corporate industries and the capital, you find that if you as a community want to have a community developed energy project, there is less support by governments, because you're not going to be, you're not the big company that has to bribe them and all this. So you find a real struggle for this. And I'm glad that Dr. Otichilo mentioned this project. I think it's going to be very important for the Council of Governors, not only to look at those, there is a difference between empowerment and power. And we've got to start giving power to communities. A lot of our projects are about empowerment, really tokenistic charity and justice. And so we've got to start to think about what are the sort of projects that we support communities that may not be the $5,000 project, but could be a little bit more. But it means that for the next number of years, that community actually has power. They have the power to decide their life. They have the power to decide what projects come. They have the power to decide the investments and the investors they bring into their space. And I think that for me is what really will start to shift power to women. And again, as we think about, and I don't disagree with climate adaptation, but let us be very cautious that climate adaptation does not normalize the struggle that women face, the constant struggle that women face under the guise of adapting. Because again, we've all seen that we adapt, we talk about adaptation so much that we adapt to the injustice that we face amongst us. I think as we think around how to support communities, I think we sometimes over-support them just on the little project, but like I'm reaching out, this is to Christian Aid and all other partners working in the sector, is to also think around how to support communities to come together and to collectivize their struggle, to collectivize their voice, so that it is not individual communities going to the cope, but as individual people go to the cope. And as we've seen in this case, many were excluded due to the vaccine appetite. We actually are able to know that wherever I am, there are people who are voicing my struggle because of the collective efforts that have been made, are continuously being made throughout the process. So that COP is not just an event, but the struggle to cope and the struggle before COP, the struggle during COP is really sort of, synergized together. So I'll leave it at that, but I really hope that we can continue the struggle, these conversations, because the climate justice struggle is not a one thing. It's actually climate justice, if we really want to do it, it's got to be unpacked and really looked at from different people, from the labor, from trade, from women, from the LGBTQ, from health issues, from production, livelihood, etc. We've got to really create the movement and organize, really organize ourselves and organize communities around this issue. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ikal. There's so much that I'm going to hopefully, in my summing up, be able to pull out of that. That was so rich. Thank you. So I'm going to pass over to our final speaker today, Rudelmar from the ACT Alliance. After Rudelmar, we do have a short film as well. I appreciate that we're just sort of getting to time. So please bear with us. If you feel you need to leave, that's okay as well. But just to hand over straight to Rudelmar.
Thank you very much, Fiona. In this report issued by Christian Aid, it's very clear the call for the responsibility of the international community to address issues related to climate justice or climate change and also gender inequalities. But we all know that the international community is failing in many fronts since many decades ago, especially on issues related to climate change and gender justice. We all know that this is affecting especially women and girls in their human dignity, but also our own human existence with the lack of attention to the climate change. So, and despite of some of the improvements in sustainable environmental practices implemented by governments, we are still seeing problems in terms of to revert the increasing emission of the CO2s. And the same for gender justice. We see a lot of commitments and advancements in women's rights, but we are far from achieving gender justice and and climate justice. And the perennial question here is why that is happening. And we know that some religious leaders and faith-based organizations still perpetuate patriarchy. They still are supporting social and cultural norms that are undermining women's rights and also gender justice. And we know, as Dr. Wilbur mentioned here, that governments, they are excellent. They are very good in preparing statements and commitments, especially the COPs. But at the end of the day, nothing is happening, except when initiatives as in Kenya that were mentioned here happen. So, but there is one point that we cannot avoid to speak about. That is the association or the close connections of the lack of commitment to climate change and gender justice to colonization. We know that colonization is one of the root causes of exploitations, inequalities, discriminations, and subjugation of people. And the responsibility of the international community and many stakeholders, including faith-based organizations, is to have a decolonized approach in their actions for climate and for gender. And faith-based, my colleague here mentioned a faith-based, feminist, decolonial, and rights-based response. It's critical for achieving climate justice. That is not disassociated. And these include practices of solidarity with people already on the front line of the climate emergency, and women, human rights defenders as well, that are advocating for structural changes in all these areas. And for doing that, of course, that will imply a shift in the way of responding to inequalities and poverty, injustices, and then to move away from the pity, dependency, and also virtues of the powerful towards the empowerment and agencies of the concerned people, especially the most marginalized women, indigenous communities. But we cannot forget also that the patriarchal culture came along in many cases with the conquerors to our indigenous lands. I saw a case study of my own country here in Brazil, and that is a very good example in terms of how indigenous communities have been imposed with culture that were not native. And it's exactly in doing these connections of a patriarchal system which take lands and reinforce the colonization by the colonizers, which take the lands as territory to be conquered, explored, and abused. And the same notion we can, when we talk about gender justice, we can mention in terms of the women's bodies as a territory to be conquered, domesticated, and abused. And that came together with the colonization to our lands. And solidarity in that case is a key element to overcome a system based on exploitation, which takes lands, territories, and bodies as places to be conquered, dominated, and colonized. So a feminist faith perspective will build on agency of women and vulnerable groups to decide on the autonomy of their bodies as their territory as well. And there are strong links between environmental stress and sexual and gender-based violence, as you know, and the report stresses that as well, often leading to climate-induced and forced migrations with disproportionately impacts on women, and particularly women from marginalized, indigenous, and caste communities. And we have to challenge negative social norms, systems, and structures and processes that consider Earth as a place of endless resources to exploit and dominate. And we cannot also address the climate emergency in isolation, and the international community needs to have a coordinated effort to work for climate justice as a matter of racial and gender justice. Many women are facing increased unpaid care and domestic work due to climate-related shortages of food, fuel, and water. They are exposed to trafficking and forced labor, especially during and after the climate-related disasters. That's our cases. We have evidences of that. It's not just blah, 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 as have been mentioning several times during this COP26. And the international community needs to provide greater focus on carbon-neutral climate resilience development, with a particularly focus on the differentiated impact on women. We need to do all the actions we need to take very strongly this dimension. And that included redistribution and reparations, the provision of public goods, and also equity between countries with planetary boundaries. And as faith actors like the ACT Alliance that are committed to gender, racial, and climate justice, we have to call on member states, the United Nations, but also the entire civil society to address the structural inequalities and women's needs, to ensure women and girls in all their diversity that they are at the forefront of decision-making. And that is a key element, because still in the 21st century, we do not have the minimum in terms of participation of women in decision-making. But also to support collective actions and address social norms, policies, and laws that constrains women's access to and control over resources. And you know that in most of our countries. In Latin America, that is a big, big problem. And we have to pressure governments and donors to increase international climate financing to address loss and damage and adaptations, provided as grants, not as loan, because that's part of the patriarchal and also the colonial approach that we have experiences in our different regions. And also we need to enable networking and building of alliance between UN agencies, faith-based and other civil society actors working for gender and climate justice to support women's collective actions for a gender-just climate response. And also to ensure that women are at the center of climate change, mitigation and adaptations, that they participate fully in climate change policy and decision-making, as I mentioned before. If we will not address these topics, I do not know where we will stop as humanity. That is a shameful and political failure of humanity to address the problems that we know that exist, that you are facing, and you are seeing the victims of this model that were mentioned several times in terms of the neoliberal, the colonial, the patriarchal structures. When we will stop? And we have the COVID-19 pandemic that has shown that we have not believed, and you are still not believing that that can kill people. It's amazing, but we need to do something. Very congratulations to Christian Aid for issuing these reports, and now you need to go to actions and to implement the recommendations. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Rudelmar. So I'm absolutely thrilled to say that the Honourable Charity Katambi, member of the Kenyan National Parliament, has been able to join us. Were you stuck on the train from Edinburgh today? Because there's apparently this is why Amanda's not here with us. and just as I mentioned her name, Amanda arrives, which is fantastic. So I'll just hand over to you, the Right Honourable Charity, and I will great to hear from you.
Thank you very much. It's okay. Thank you very much. Sorry for my lateness. There was a stuck of the train, the technology challenge. I'm Charity Katambi Chepkonye, Member of Parliament from Kenya. I'm a member of Parliamentary Committee on Environment and Natural Resources. I also chair the Parliamentary Caucus on Renewable Energy and Climate Change. I also am a Deputy Secretary, Kenya Women Parliamentary Association. But for today, let me just take a few minutes to just mention, to say that thank you so much for Christian Aid to invite me in this fantastic talk. This is my part of my interest. And actually, I just love starting by saying climate change is real. And I'm also happy that the countries are now uniting for a very serious talk in relation with the climate change. But also I have a different concept, which I say that anytime we talk about climate change, probably in Kenya, when we have floods, when we have drought, when we have famine, when we are losing livestock right now, it is a story in Africa. The majority of the people who are getting a lot of impact, it is women and the children. Therefore, I want to sit here and say that this is a high time we united as a nation, and also we ask ourselves, what are we actually doing that we are going to save people? And my position is that we must now work hard to make sure that whatever we are doing, we must go back to the grassroots level. Let us think of ways we are going to empower women from the grassroots level. I'm happy recently when I heard the President of Republic of Kenya saying that we are now as a country going to stop the deforestation in the country. It is also on that point I want to say that when we talk about Africa or Kenya itself, it's better we note that the forests are getting destroyed, not because people want to destroy them. It is because of the problem and the challenges. When you go to like Kenya and when we are talking about clean cooking to majority of the biggest percentage, which are around 70%, they actually rely on forest where they get charcoals and the firewood. Therefore, when we are talking about adaptations, what are we actually doing to make sure that the women at grassroots levels are actually getting assistance? Therefore, for me at this position, I'll just be saying that this is the high time. We lobbied, as the last conversation has been told there, that the donors, like the partnerships, must be lobbied seriously to ensure that we get more funding. And actually, I want to say as a woman, do we even, when we are talking about climate change, do we actually even have the budget in relation with gender matters? This is a high time I will also challenge women in the entire world that can we also have a voice to say that what is for women? If we are saying the climate change is impacting many people and the most affected people are women and the children, what are we actually, do we even have the budget for women? What are those specific practical actions can we take to these rural women, whichever part of the world? And in relation with that, let us see it in a broader way, what is doable. If today we are talking about clean cooking, do we have organizations which at least can make sure that there is also expansion of renewable energy, that people can also get like electric cooking? Can we also talk about other special ways of maybe affordable and also reliable sources of clean cooking to save ABCD? Do we also have organizations which can support these women in their rural areas like smart agriculture? Therefore, I think it is a wake-up that today we should ask ourselves, since we have talked about Paris Agreement every time, since we have gone to very many COP meetings, what are we actually achieving? For me, it is a wake-up that today when we are seated here at Glasgow, let us ask ourselves, are we actually going to take an action, or are we still expecting another COP so that we can meet and talk. I think it should be working as today, guys, because we have suffered so much. And I want to support the last person who has spoken to say that it is also, we should remind one another that you are not safe as a nation if you are successful and others are just dying. Actually, you have seen the COVID has hit all of us, the poor, the rich nations. The climate change, the same way it's going to hit us. But I think it's a high time we can take an action, we can do something. And as a member of parliament, we are not only going to talk about legislations, we are not going only to talk about the good laws, we are now going to talk about which action are we doing. And actually, I also wish to say that as I talk too much, I also appreciate there's some steps my country are doing here and there with the county government, with also the National Assemblies through constituency funds where we give around 2% for in our constituency funding. Therefore, it is a waking voice that what are we actually doing to make this world better for all of us. Thank you so much. I might have taken a lot of time.
Right, Honourable Charity, you have not taken a lot of time. That was a very impassioned call for action, I think. So it was a brilliant way to finish our panellists. Now, luckily, our fantastic NGO, Amanda Kosi Mukwashi, has arrived. She was on the same train. So I'd like to invite Amanda to come and share some insights and share some of her thoughts. I'll give up my seat.
Good morning. Morning to you. Good morning. Good morning, everyone.
Morning. Welcome.
My profound apologies. But, you know, these things happen. We were told that there was an incident along the line of rail. I'm just hoping that it wasn't something that was fatal or serious, because normally when there's such kind of delay, it means that it's something that is quite serious. But thank you to Scott Rail for getting us here. So good morning, and I'm really sorry that I missed what you said. I think that I would like to just sort of take a step back a little bit and just share some of my reflections that I've been thinking about as Christian Aid launches this report on women on the front line. And the step back that I'm making, or that I'm taking, is we've been talking about gender justice for quite a long time. Those who have come before me, at least, speak of Mexico 1975. Others speak of the Nairobi Forward-Looking Strategies in 1985, when we're talking about women's rights and gender issues. I remember 1995 in Beijing when we were talking about gender justice and gender issues. And throughout those conversations, those global conversations, I think we belabored the point on women being at the front line, women bearing the brunt of poverty, extreme injustice, extreme inequalities, that it is women who feel it, it's women who walk that talk, it's women who are holding our societies together. And so to find ourselves having to have that conversation once again in this climate conversation, it can be quite frustrating, I have to say, that the global majority, women, are at the receiving end of our climate inaction. They're at the receiving end of our inaction in terms of economics, in terms of politics, in terms of social, in terms of religion, and in terms of climate. So that's the backdrop of my reflections. And so when we say that enough is enough, and when we say the time is now for action, I think it's really important to take the conversations around climate finance, around loss and damage, around 1.5, I think let's take it away from just the technical negotiations that are going on, and let's bring the lived experiences and the lived realities of women in our communities, in all our communities, regardless of which country you go to. What you find is that as climate change impacts and hits the ground, whether it's frequent floods, whether it's frequent droughts or more intense floods, the people who are having to bear that brunt are the women in our communities, rural communities, peri-urban communities, urban communities, the urban poor, it is the women. This is in addition rather than as a replacement of. It's in addition to the inequalities and injustices that they're experiencing. So when you talk about water scarcity in parts of Kenya that have been hit by drought, it's the women, the mothers who are going to get up to walk that 8 kilometers to go and find a river that is dry, right? And get the water where they can find it, right? And they will be doing so coming from a family where they're income poor, where there's income poverty, whether it means they've got no shoes, whether it means they've got no food for that day, whether it means that their livelihoods is at stake. That's the lived realities. And so I have to say that when I have been listening and following some of the conversations that have been taking place inside the negotiation rooms, when I've been hearing of that, I think sometimes we get too stuck in the detail of the words, and we fight over that, and we forget that actually behind these words, behind this data, behind these statistics are real people. And so without taking too much time, I think what I want to add to the conversation, and I'm sure that you've already raised some of the issues, is for me what this report highlights is a number of things. And let me just talk about 5 of them very, very quickly. The first one is that it is, yet again, we remind decision makers, policymakers, activists, that if we want to know the real impact of climate change, if we want to understand the solutions, the potential solutions, if we want to know the obstacles that sit between us and getting there at community level, we have to go to the women. We have to ask them, because they are not just being impacted, they are living with climate crisis, right? They are surviving in spite of our lack of action, right? So let's ask them, what are some of those key things that we need to be talking about? So their knowledge is critical. The fact that that knowledge is not brought into the decision-making spaces, I think is quite disheartening for us. So knowledge, their knowledge that is based on their lived experiences. In the decision-making space, I was recently interviewed and by another news outlet. And the question they asked me was, why do you think it's important for women to be at the table of decision-making? Why do you think it's important for women to be in leadership? And my response was actually, I don't want to be answering that question anymore. I said, don't ask me that question anymore. Because the question you should ask is, why should men be in decision-making, right, if at all? But we don't ask that question. I think we should move away from having to justify and rationalize our need to be in decision-making spaces. We are the global majority in the world. We should be sitting at those tables and contributing to making those choices and those decisions. I think what this report flags up is, let's bring at every level, all the different levels women need to be in those decision-making spaces, as do indigenous communities. I'm sure that there was an example that was looked at. The third thing that I want to say is on the issue of resources. Yeah, I think this COP has been, I think it's a missed opportunity. You know, honorables, excellencies, and my fellow activists, I think it's been a missed opportunity. I think when the young people who marched and spoke out said, as we come together in these rooms, we are doing so to just appease our sense of we're trying to do something, but actually maybe we are not serious and committed to making a difference. I think it's very difficult to argue with those sentiments from young people. We know that, one, those that are being impacted on right now by climate change are those who contributed the least to the issue. We know that they're already losing and there's need for loss and damage to be taken into account. That compensation, we need to repair, and then we need to think about doing no harm in the future. There are two things, they're not mutually exclusive. We need to look at the impact and the consequences right now and to repair and to restore. And then as we look forward, we need to think about doing no harm. For me, those are two sides to loss and damage and to 1.5. That's how we do it. We change our behaviors for the future to keep 1.5 on target, and we restore and repair what has happened in the past to make sure that those communities can still thrive and move forward. And then the last thing that I want to say is that, and this report I think really shows that when we stand together in solidarity, what we've seen is women coming together. You know, I've seen women coming together in Ethiopia, I've seen them come together in Kenya, I've seen them come together in Bolivia, in Colombia. I've seen them come together against the odds to try and overcome. So I think the message that I want to leave is rather than be completely discouraged by, I think, what is seen for me when I hear the conversation around loss and damage, climate finance, and even when I really unpack and say, what is the 100 billion really? Is it about grants? Is it about loans? Is it going to create more debt for for countries which are already in debt distress? And what's the impact on women on the front lines on that? I want to say that the hope that I have is that finally the world has woken up to the issue of the climate crisis. Our young people are saying enough is enough. They are the global majority in most of our countries, right? And so I want to encourage them that this is not the time for you to keep quiet. This is the time for you to stand up and march forward. Call out the injustice every day as you see it. Perhaps those that are older have become complacent. You know, it is time that if you're not doing anything, move out of the way. Let us use the power of our voice and our agency to bring about the change and save this planet for ourselves and for our future generations. Whether it's democracy, whether it's climate finance, whether it's development, it must have meaning in the household, in every single community in the world. If it doesn't have meaning in that place, then we are losing the fight against the climate crisis. I'll stop there. Thank you very much. And I'm sorry again for having missed the conversation, but thank you so much for being with us.
I think that was a great contribution to be the final contribution for today, because I think it hit all the points which all of the other speakers have been making. I come away feeling, Yes, there is frustration. There's frustration because, in the words of our esteemed colleague, His Excellency, the technical negotiators are in there arguing about the minutiae of detail when there's a big picture that really needs to be addressed. But I feel reassured that there's real leadership being shown. We've heard today about what's happening at a county level in Kenya. We've heard today about what's happening at that sort of bigger macro level in Kenya as well, and that's fantastic. And what this report shows is that every single day in communities all around the world, women are leading, women are taking actions which are making sure that the poorest in Bangladesh are getting social protection, that women are really circumventing all of those gender roles in Honduras. Not only are they actually putting in the solar panels, but they're also really leading in their communities as well. And we know that the Quilombola communities in the Amazon are not taking it lying down the fact that their ancestral lands are being completely and utterly trashed in order to deliver on the renewable energy. But they're standing up and they're using that collective action that's been mentioned by a number of our speakers to really say, enough's enough, time for climate action. And just to echo the words of Ikal, it really struck me whenever she told me, or she told the whole room, that there's a difference between power and empowerment. Empowerment's something that's done to you. Power is something that you seize and you take and then you act. So with that, I just want to thank all of our speakers today. I want to say the time is now. Let's act on climate change. Let's not let our young people down, because whenever I spoke to them yesterday, they were very clear. They don't want to come to COP to eat nice food and stay in a nice hotel. They want to come to COP to actually get in there and speak to the world leaders and make a difference. So we're going to leave with a short film, which is one of our partners in the Philippines. We actually were able to leave the Philippines last year because when you do development, you should always have an exit strategy. And what we did was we worked with our partner, and now they're brilliant, and now they're leading for themselves. So we'll finish with that, and then have a great COP, everybody, and a really good rest of the day. Thank you.
Good day to all. On behalf of my colleagues at the Institute for Climate and Sustainable Cities, we'd like to commend Christian Aid and its partners for putting up this report and organizing this timely discussion. We are an international climate and energy group based here in the Philippines that engages decision makers at different levels to advance a fair climate policy that enables resilient and low carbon development. Through our Recharge Filipinos program, we're generating practical lessons that would inform our policy initiatives on how communities that are devastated by extreme weather events will be able to not just recover, but chart a better, more durable, and enduring development path on their own. Being the easternmost off-grid island community in the country facing the Pacific and home to more than 1,500 residents, Suluan, which means beacon, has been historically a gateway of the country from colonizers and typhoons. But Typhoon Haiyan in 2013 was one that hit the community hardest. It obliterated coconut farms, which were the island's main source of livelihood. In 2016, we collaborated with Sulong Suluan, or Advanced Suluan. It's a community self-help group composed of 15 women on a solar home system project. Rather than deliver a one-off humanitarian grant from Christian Aid, we co-designed with them a rollover payout scheme that would allow them to leverage and invest in another solar project. It's in the form of a freezer that enabled them to store meat and make ice and sell cold water to the island, and sometimes store emergency medicines and vaccines for its residents. When Christian Aid ended its Philippine program in 2020, we continued to work in Suluan, with Sulong Suluan as our co-partner. For us, investment was not just on the so-called hardware or solar power technology. We invested more on the so-called software systems and processes that allowed members of Sulong-Suluan to build their confidence to be able to invest and manage the solar power systems. We termed it Solar Scholars Training, and we further tried to improve the modules catering to the needs of women who are actually the energy users and managers of their respective households and their community. It was not just a matter of access to technology, but in communities, it is critical that technology related to energy be at the hands of women, as they have to rely on themselves when the ocean and the weather do not allow them to get to the main island. My colleagues in Recharge Pilipinas added another investment, and we call it Orgware, which at a closer look are actually approaches that enable Sulong-Suluan to further strengthen their group, learn from the lessons of other community-based women's groups outside of Suluan, and in the process, nurture these relationships and connections. Those were investments that continue to reap. Sulong-Suluan continue to pay it forward, and it's the women began driving community conversations and actively championed a vision for a green, resilient landscape in their community development plan, integrating environmental challenges of garbage being swept into the island, deteriorating fishing grounds, but also practical steps towards a prosperous community that is powered by mainly renewable energy. And with the COVID-19 pandemic, Sulong-Suluan are the governance reliable and steadfast partners in promoting public health and vaccination drives in the community, reminding us again that during this pandemic and in every emergency, governments have top partners in communities, and it's the women's groups. Similarly, what Sulong-Suluan has successfully pushed was the same point that we have been saying all along. Integrate climate into the development planning rather than treat it as a separate issue. In the same breath, we cannot treat climate as a separate issue of mitigation and adaptation, different from socioeconomic development challenges that confront common people, especially women. Vulnerable communities like Suluan are confronting these multiple challenges on their own, optimizing meager resources amidst a conservative projection that significant portions of their island and other low-lying communities in the Philippines will be submerged by an estimated 0.6 meters if the world continues to be doing business as usual. Despite that, 8 years after Typhoon Haiyan, kerosene as a main source of fuel has been replaced by predominantly solar power systems. If the mothers from these communities showed with tenacity and sheer determination that they can enable a better community and provide a fighting chance for their children and grandchildren, while at the same time cope and confront the challenges they are facing, how much more if resources, finance, technology, capacity finally flow to communities and nations most at risk with climate change. Women's groups such as Sulong-Suluan continue to inspire us to do more, and we will continue to be a partner with women's groups and feminists and support them as they claim and reclaim the development spaces and their own agencies. Doing so is a strategic climate action, and that is not only a win of and for women, but also a win for climate. Have a good day and may you have a fruitful discussion. Padayon tayong lahat.